GMs for hire.
Welcome back to GMs for Hire. I am Matthew Perry. With me today, Will Polston, and we are back for some Hall of Fame talk. The voting is coming up for the Baseball Hall of Fame. The ballot's out, been out now for a couple of weeks. And of course, you know, we had to come in and share our thoughts on this year's ballot. There are plenty of newcomers that could potentially have a case for this year's Hall of Fame, especially a couple guys that have been around for a while, of course. And we're kind of going to break down the ones that we think have a shot. There are 30 men on the ballot. We're going to be talking about 8 of them specifically. Towards the end, we might discuss a couple guys that may have just missed the cut. Stick around for that. Of course, if you're looking for a specific player, timestamps will be down below. Find your favorite potential Hall of Famer, and we'll tell you what we think of them. We're going to start with all the 10th year guys, actually, or at least the ones we think have a shot. And we're going to start with Barry Bonds, you know, the home run king, walks king. There isn't that much to say about Barry Bonds just because you know how good of a baseball player he is. But, Will, I guess I'll be rather direct with it. Do you think Barry Bonds is a Hall of Famer?
Barry Bonds is the greatest baseball player of all time. I think it's an absolute disservice to have a Hall of Fame and not have the greatest player in the Hall of Fame. I mean, this guy was literally feared when it came to batting. And, you know, everybody's going to say, oh, the steroids, whatever. But him and Clemens are in the same boat. And they were both in an era before steroids was really a big deal. You know, back before the Mitchell report, you know, back before everything came out to where, you know, the MLB really started putting a full restriction on steroids. Really, baseball was just kind of turning a blind eye. And Barry Bonds was literally the most feared hitter of all time. Even if you took the time beforehand, before he started taking steroids, and you split his career into 2, and we'll get to this with another player, you have 2 Hall of Fame careers. Like the guy was an absolute stud. I mean, all-time home run leader, the home run king, the walks king, intentional walks. You know, he's been intentionally walked more than he's ever had plate appearances in a season, except for twice. And this guy played for 22 years. And it's absolutely ridiculous how much this guy was feared. 7-time MVP is absolutely ridiculous. It's something that'll never be done again. It's just absurd. Barry Bonds is the greatest player of all time, and I think it's just ridiculous to keep him out of the Hall, because even steroids or not, whether you were part of the Balco scandal, whether it was before or after the Mitchell report, he was an absolute stud and the most feared hitter in baseball history, most likely.
Yeah, it's hard to deny Barry Bonds being worth the Hall of Fame. It really, I think, comes down to how you value steroids. Like you said, you know, baseball in the 90s, they kind of turned a blind eye. Bud Selig's Major League Baseball was definitely more lax when it came to steroids and stuff like that. But you can't really fault the players for that. They're kind of just playing with the cards they're dealt. You know, same goes for Clemens, Palmeiro, guys like that in the 90s who kind of fell to that steroid issue. But Bonds was a complete player. I mean, he has over 500 stolen bases, which puts him in elite company on the base paths, along with, you know, being the all-time leader in home runs. He's the all-time single season leader in home runs with 73. Really, he did everything. 8 Gold Gloves. He was a great fielder as well, especially in his early days with the Pirates. I mean, there's really no denying the talent. It really just comes down to how you value steroids. And for us, I think I could speak for you here. We both would check Barry Bonds on our ballot as a Hall of Famer. It's an easy choice for us, really. You can't deny the talent. Steroids are not. It's his 10th year. The Hall of Fame is already kind of questionable with Pete Rose not being in there for the gambling stuff. You know, you wouldn't want another question mark there with missing out on Bonds. So easy check mark for us. We'll lead off with Bonds heading to the Hall. We'll move on to Roger Clemens, another victim of the steroid era, another great generational pitcher. I mean, you talk about stuff that'll never be done again. 7 Cy Young Award wins. I don't know if anybody's even close to that, really, if anyone has more than 4 or 5. He was special. I mean, 24 seasons. He did this for a very long time. And, you know, just his age 42 season, he had a 1.87 ERA, which we rarely see players nowadays finish with ERAs below 2. What he did even at that age, was very, very special. I mean, all-time wins, I want to say he's top 10 to be sure. I mean, he has 354 of them. Elite company, no denying that. Will, let me get your thoughts on Clemens.
My craziest thing about Roger Clemens, whenever I was looking at him, is that his ERA continues to go down as you get deeper into the postseason. And I understand that postseason isn't necessarily, it doesn't go into awards or anything such as that. So his 7 Cy Youngs are completely without these stats, which is even more crazy. He has a 4+ ERA in divisional series. He has a 3.85 in ERA in championship series, and he has a 2.37 ERA in World Series. Like, it's absolutely ridiculous how his stats go down. When the stage get bigger, Clemens gets better. And a 7-time Cy Young Award winner. Again, another thing that's just never going to be done again. An MVP, which is something you never see from pitchers. Yeah. A 2-time Triple Crown winner. From the pitching side, 7 times leading the MLB in ERA. That's something that's completely unheard of. You're having somebody like Jacob deGrom, who, his current day, one of the MLB leaders in ERA almost every single season. But think about it, he'd have to do it 5 more times. It's absolutely ridiculous to think about. Roger Clemens, again, falls into the era before the Mitchell report, before, part of the Balco scandal, but still before MLB really started putting the hammer down on steroids. And so for me, I can't really punish him for that, because this is back whenever MLB was turning a blind eye. And even if you take the steroids out of it, if you take the years prior to before before the Balco scandal, before everything, again, it's another situation such like Barry Bonds, to where he's a Hall of Famer again. A 3-time Cy Young Award winner, and won an MVP before the Balco scandal. It's absolutely ridiculous what these two guys have done, and it's taken them 10 years at least to get into the Hall of Fame. Roger Clemens is a little bit more hated, I feel like, compared to Barry Bonds. I feel like he's a little bit more of a controversial player, just because of some attitude issues that he had in the league. Barry Bonds, I feel like, is a little bit more of a likable guy, but still, I feel like both of them have to be in the hall. I think if one goes into the hall, you have to let the other in. I feel like they almost go hand in hand at this point. And for me, I check the box with Barry Bonds. I have to check the box with Roger Clemens.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I'm checking the box on Clemens. They go hand in hand, but ironically, Bonds was the one somewhat blackballed from baseball. He was right on the brink of 3,000 hits. His final season, I want to say he hit like 28 home runs, somewhere around there. He never really slowed down, and neither did Clemens. I mean, his final season, he had a 4.18 ERA, but that was his age 44 year in 2007. He thought he was going to retire, came back, and wound up playing a couple more seasons with the Yankees. But he won a Cy Young at age 41. As I mentioned, his ERA was under 2 at age 42. I mean, Clemens and Bonds go hand in hand because they're two of the best to ever do it, both offensively and on the mound. So, yeah, it's only fair we check those boxes. We'll move to another one who's in his 10th year, Curt Schilling. He had controversy last season when he wasn't voted in. He came up just short, kind of publicly shared his thoughts on that. He wasn't too happy with it, kind of, called the Hall of Fame a fraud, not, illegitimate, and basically said from there that he doesn't want to be voted in. He doesn't want to be part of this, I guess, somewhat corrupt system. He can refer to it as, and, we see ballots that are turned in on Twitter or social media, and some of them are questionable, but everyone's entitled to their own opinion. I'm sure some of you watching might have issues with what we say about some of the players here, but
probably already,
yeah, that's part of the ballot process. There's always going to be some kind of pushback from fans, from outsiders. So Schilling, for a second, kind of became a fan and shared his own pushback last year, but we're still going to take a look at him. 6-time All-Star. He's got 3 rings. 300 Ks in a season, 3+ times. There's no denying he was a fantastic pitcher. Postseason wise, 11-2, 2.23 ERA. Special stuff, especially in the postseason when it matters most. Him and Randy Johnson in Arizona, one of the best 1-2 punches in a rotation of all time, at least that I can think of. He has over 200 wins. He does have quite the resume, but is it enough? Well,
I think it's plenty. Whenever you're looking at Curt Schilling, a lot of his career was kind of overshadowed by Randy Johnson. You know, whenever he was there in Arizona, they had one of the most dominant 1-2 punches in MLB history. Whenever you look back, it's hard to find 1-2 combos that are that good. I mean, obviously, you can look at Maddox, Maddox Glavin. You can look at, that era. But nowadays, I guess you could get ready to maybe compare DeGrom Scherzer if it all works out. But other than that, it's hard to find a 1-2 punch that is as solid as Randy Johnson, Curt Schilling. I feel like Curt Schilling has been kind of overshadowed because of the fact that he's been with decent, with other great Hall of Fame pitchers. And he almost reminds me a little bit of Zach Greinke. And I went back and I looked at it, and because we did a video on Zach Greinke, you and I both agreed that Zach Greinke should be a Hall of Famer. Zach Greinke has been the stud early on, was the stud with the Royals, but as his career went on, he was never really the ace on the staff. He wasn't the ace in LA. He wasn't the ace in Houston. As it goes on, there's a couple of teams that Greinke goes to, and he's a really good too. And I went and looked, and their numbers are very comparable as well. In fact, I was sitting there thinking, these numbers look a lot like Greinke, and then I went down on Baseball Reference, and I want to say he was the number 1 or number 2 player compared to Curt Schilling. So, in my opinion, after looking back at those numbers, if we let Zach Greinke in, I feel like you have to let Curt Schilling in. And I know a lot of people are saying don't give him the vote because he said he didn't want to be in there. And this is a pretty heavy ballot to where a lot of players, you can make a really solid case. But for me, just going off of, hey, I want to put some players in, Curt Schilling is one of those players that would receive my vote if my vote counted. So I personally am checking the box on Schilling.
Schilling's a tough one for me. And I know you and I discussed this off air. He obviously has a good resume, but I'm finding just some kind of inconsistency throughout his career. And, you look at the teams he was on, and it's not his fault. He played for a Phillies team that, in the late 90s struggled. They finished last several seasons, but it does somewhat affect his numbers. And you find that, the ERA is there, a 2.97 ERA in 97. He's an all-star, but, that's when the Phillies starting to pick up. But before that, you have some ERAs in the 4s, you have some mid-3s. Win-loss record is here nor there. It shouldn't be valued that highly, but that's not fantastic either. And, even strikeouts wise, efficiency wise on the mound, he's not doing anything super special. It's not until maybe, around the late 90s with Philly, and then when he heads over to Arizona, that he really starts kicking it into gear. And at that point, he's already early 30s. You already have a whole half of your career. He played 20 years where nothing's really going for you. Like, you're a good pitcher, and there are some good numbers here that I see, but nothing's really standing out to me. And of course, it's not how you start, it's how you finish in some cases. And there are players on this ballot that have that case running for them. And you could make that claim for Schilling. He finished second place in Cy Young voting 3 times. And it wasn't until his age 34, 35, and 37 seasons. So, when he came to those more successful teams like the Diamondbacks, like the Boston Red Sox, who he broke the curse with, obviously things start kicking into gear, but you kind of want to be a competent pitcher, whether or not your team is winning. And obviously he had more help on those winning teams, accompanied with Randy Johnson on the Diamondbacks, Pedro Martinez for a part of his time in Boston. I don't know. It's really tough to say for me. Obviously you get 10 votes, but the way things are for me with the Hall of Fame, Cooperstown's one of those. It's not like, in my opinion, Canton for the Pro Football Hall of Fame kind of is a little more lenient on who they allow into the Hall of Fame. And one thing I love about Cooperstown is it's pretty exclusive. I only want the best of the best in there. And Schilling, no doubt about it, at points was elite in his career, but I'm still not seeing enough to give him that check mark. I don't mind not checking 10 boxes because, like I said, I want it to be exclusive. So I'm not going to check the box here for Curt Schilling. And I completely understand why you do, Will. He definitely has some advantages, some statistics where you could mark him. But personally, I'm going to hold off. And, maybe things will look different for the Veterans Committee in however many years. But, yeah, for now, he's going to go 10 and not make it in.
I mean, ultimately, that's what he said he wanted anyway. He said he wanted to go to the Veterans Committee. He said he wants to rely on that. So, I mean, if honestly, he probably, if he doesn't get voted in this year, I think he's still a happy guy. I mean, obviously, he's come out, he's made his remarks known, whether it be politically driven or not. Obviously, a lot of people are kind of against him because of stuff like that. But I mean, at the end of the day, I still feel like that's one of those Veterans Committee guys, one of those guys that eventually you're going to see in the Hall. I don't think you get that close, not make the Hall, and then never make it. Like I don't know the numbers on that. I don't know how many people come within just a couple of percentage points and then don't make the Veterans Committee, but I'd imagine it's a pretty low number. So I still think if I still looking statistically, I still feel like if Greinke's going to make it, because we were talking now, if Greinke was to retire now, is he a Hall of Fame?
Right.
And I still think if Greinke was to make it now, I think Schilling has to go in there as well. So granted, the accolades a little bit more fills up the page a little bit more for Greinke, but the statistics are still pretty comparable. So I still feel like I have to check the box on Schilling just to let him into the Hall of Fame. I still feel like he's one of those guys who I could see in Cooperstown.
Maybe somewhere down the road things change, but for now, we will remain split on that difference maker in our two ballots. We'll move to Alex Rodriguez, one of the most polarizing professional athletes of all time, let alone MLB players. Personally, one of my favorite players of all time. Him and Jeter were like gods to me, still kind of are. But all bias aside for this one, let's talk A-Rod. 696 home runs, fourth all time. Of course, he was also involved in steroids, missed the entire 2014 season due to his suspension because of that. Definitely a controversial guy, had attitude, issues. There were moments throughout his career. He won the one World Series in 2009, 14-time All-Star. Of course, you cannot, I think, like Bonds and Clemens, you can't really deny A-Rod's talent, because even from the start, from the opening days in Seattle with the Mariners, the talent was always there. It earned him a big contract in Texas. Of course, eventually got him traded to the Yankees. And I think his legend was really made there in a more of a spotlight. But Will, let me get your thoughts on A-Rod.
I think if you have a Mount Rushmore of baseball shortstops, Alex Rodriguez has to be up there. Alex Rodriguez, and if you're a top four in your position of all time, you deserve to be in the Hall of Fame. And Alex Rodriguez spent his tail end, not even at shortstop, but he was still in the, I think he's still in the Mount Rushmore of shortstops of all time. I mean, Alex Rodriguez was a fantastic shortstop, a great defender, an amazing hitter, one of the best hitters, probably number one or number two best hitting shortstops of all time.
Absolutely.
It has to be up there. Obviously, top 5 home runs, MLB history. And what I like about A-Rod is that he served his suspension. He didn't try to fight the system. He just kind of bit the bullet. He goes, I did something wrong. He righted his wrong, and he came back and continued to play. I mean, he only played, I want to say, what was it, 3 seasons after his suspension. So nothing too crazy. But even afterwards, I mean, A-Rod's becoming even a likable guy in the media. He's becoming a guy that's just, pro baseball. He's becoming a face of baseball, becoming a commentator, becoming a valued member in the media as well. I think A-Rod, I think statistically A-Rod has to be in there. I think without a doubt, steroids are not. I mean, I feel like with the steroids, you have to hold them a little bit to a higher standard. And when you go over 3,000 hits and fourth most home runs of all time, I don't know how much higher of a standard you can do. I mean, that's a pretty high standard, and he managed to hit it. Like I said, in my opinion, one of the greatest shortstops of all time. And I think just without steroids, I mean, obviously a surefire Hall of Famer first ballot without a question. So I think there may be a little pushback because of the steroid era, or because of the steroid issue. And there may be a little bit of a pushback. So maybe not year one, but again, if I have a ballot, I'm checking A-Rod's name. I mean, I feel like I have to.
Yeah, first ballot's tough to say. Obviously, steroids turns a lot of people off, but like I said with Bonds and Clemens, you can't deny this talent. I mean, earlier in his career, he was a 5-tool player. He stole 46 bases at one point in his career. The guy had it all. He started having some hip issues. He wound up having surgery for that, missed some time later in his career. Like you mentioned, after the suspension, he did play 2 more seasons. He hit 33 home runs. the season directly after, but unfortunately was struggling in 2016. He was only hitting 200. So the Yankees somewhat kind of forced him into retirement. He retired mid-season after only 65 games. He did not wait till the end of the season, and that was an interesting way to go, but it's worth mentioning that his 3,000th hit, home run off Justin Verlander, only Jeter and Boggs, the other two to hit a home run for the 3,000th hit. He had his fair share of moments, of course, both good and bad. 2009, the first use of postseason replay on his home run in Philly. That's obviously stuck in my mind just because the Yankees were in the World Series, but it's significant in the bigger picture. Of course, he had his beef with Boston, Ryan Dempster, running down the first baseline, knocking the ball out of our friend Bronson Arroyo's glove. Fair share of moments, love him or hate him. He was Alex Rodriguez, he's A-Rod, and he was a fantastic baseball player. And, for me, I have to give him the check. Will it be first ballot? I doubt it, unfortunately, because I think without steroids and without a lot of the drama, he's first ballot, absolutely. And he's one of those guys that's near unanimous without all the baggage. But we'll unanimously give him the check there. And we'll move to another first-year guy. It's Big Papi, rival of Alex Rodriguez, now friends with Alex Rodriguez. It's David Ortiz, arguably the best designated hitter of all time. His 541 home runs are the most by a designated hitter. 10-time All-Star, 7-time Silver Slugger, Boston's favorite guy. I mean, he was the face of that team for many, many years. And after a rocky start to his career with Minnesota, a lot of inconsistency, placed on waivers, picked up by the Boston Red Sox, and the rest is really history. Will, talk to me about Big Papi.
Big Papi is obviously going to be a name that is going to be interesting on the ballot. It's everybody always gets thrown off by the DH. The DH is something that was, brought into the MLB later in the years. It hasn't always been the thing. Pitchers used to hit in both leagues. It is what it is, yada, yada. And the thing is that whenever you get to the DH, you have to address somebody's Hall of Fame case purely off of one side of the ball. And I feel like there's two players on this ballot that really are just one-sided players. And we're going to talk about both of them, and because of it, I think David Ortiz gets lucky because obviously the MLB prefers the hitters. As much as the DH and the writers, tend to hesitate a little bit with the DH position, Big Papi kind of made the DH position. He was obviously there were plenty before him, but whenever you think of a DH, a lot of people are going to think of David Ortiz first. He had a 55.3 WAR in his career. And you have to think that is strictly off hitting, and which is absolutely absurd because if I'm not mistaken, you mentioned to me off camera that he has a negative fielding WAR, doesn't he?
Yeah, negative D WAR. Yeah.
So that's going to affect his overall WAR. Is it going to do it a lot? Maybe not per se because he didn't field too much, but still the fact that he has basically a 55 WAR strictly off of hitting is absolutely absurd. In all seasons that he played at least 10 games, he has at least a 101 OPS plus. So that means he was an average or better hitter at all times in his career. He's basically the DH. Like I said, he's the DH that everybody thinks of, whenever you talk about it. Obviously, Edgar Martinez just got inducted into the Hall of Fame. And for me, if you're going to induct Edgar Martinez, you have to induct Big Papi. Is again another guy who I feel like might get a little bit of pushback. There was some steroid speculation. There's the DH problem. First ballot, maybe not, but I feel like this is Big Papi's a lovable guy. I feel like nobody's got the beef with with David Ortiz. Obviously, maybe during your playing days, but even somebody like him and A-Rod have gotten together. He's a likable dude. He's a guy that you can see, being on an analyst desk, future down the line as well with somebody like A-Rod. So I think Big Papi is one of the most prominent DHs in MLB history, and I'm sure he'll find his way in Cooperstown too.
Yeah, David Ortiz is known for being more of a power hitter, but you've got to acknowledge that he honestly could hit for contact too. 7 seasons in his career, as a 20-year career, he hit 300 or higher. It was really impressive what he did. We have to mention his final season because it's one of the best final seasons in MLB history. 38 home runs, 127 RBIs, led the American League. He led all of Major League Baseball in doubles with 48, led all of Major League Baseball in slugging and OPS. His OPS was over 1,000. That's how you want to go out. He went out on top, finished sixth in MVP voting at age 40. Not easy to do. I want to say he's one of the oldest players to finish that high in MVP voting. It's an impressive career. After a slow start with Minnesota, he really came into his own in Boston, became a fan favorite, became one of the best offensive hitters. You cannot really ignore what David Ortiz did. Whether or not he was involved in HGH is here nor there. I don't think he ever got suspended for it or anything, right?
No, I don't think he ever served a suspended.
No, so he was never disciplined, and that should definitely be taken into account. First ballot is tough to say. He was a fan favorite, so that'll help him quite a bit, but it really comes down to how you value designated hitters. Edgar Martinez is a clear comparison. Him and Ortiz have to be the two best DHs of all time. Martinez was a little more versatile on the field. He wasn't a great fielder, but he was able to play a couple more positions than Ortiz, who was kind of stuck at first base. I do have to mark the box for David Ortiz. He's a Hall of Famer. Will it be this year? I'm not sure. I somewhat doubt it, but I think within the next few years, most definitely David Ortiz will be a Hall of Famer. That's another unanimous one for us. We'll move to Scott Rolen, who I know is not unanimous for us because I'm not too sold on him. 17-year career. He was above average defender. Offense, he had his moments, but overall kind of fell into the average, above average category. Never elite, really, besides a couple seasons. He won the World Series with the Cardinals in 2006. Had a pretty good career. He never really declined, never really regressed. He always kind of stayed in that consistent part of the third base class. Will, tell me why you think Scott Rolen should be a Hall of Famer.
Well, I think now after we talked about the 10-year guys, we talked about a couple first ballot guys. Now we're getting into some weird guys that are just kind of on the ballot. I think if you haven't caught on by now, if we're talking about them, someone's voting for them. They're on somebody's ballot. Scott Rolen makes mine. Scott Rolen was quietly one of the greatest hitters of his time. And when I say his time, I mean his era of baseball. Whenever he was playing, from the late 90s into the early 2010s. Whenever he was there, he was always within the top 20 offensively among all positions. And that doesn't just include third baseman. He won a Silver Slugger at a point. So at one point he was considered the best hitting third baseman. Only one in his time. But the fact that one came at a point is still good. Through 17 seasons, he did have 12 seasons in which he had a 103 or higher OPS plus. And whenever he was going throughout his career, obviously he had a little bit of injury issues. Here's the big problem with Scott Rolen, and I think this is where a lot of people are getting off, is because of that late inconsistency on the field whenever he was later into his career, into the Toronto days, into the Cincinnati days. He started having shoulder issues. He started to see a little bit less games. He's had significantly less at bats than a lot of other players. If I'm not mistaken, I want to say the closest one to his at bats in recent years to make the Hall of Fame is Vladimir Guerrero. And Vladimir Guerrero is a significantly better hitter than Scott Rolen, whenever you're thinking of it. But Scott Rolen is also very, very much so defensively sound. And that was something that Vladimir Guerrero, yes, was he a good defender? Sure. You could argue that he was, an above average defender, but was he a phenomenal defender such as a Scott Rolen? I wouldn't say. And so when you have somebody who is consistently quietly up there amongst the top hitters in the league, when you have somebody who's a top 5 defender during that time, he was just sound on both sides. And he was elite on both sides and many a times. And I think that Scott Rolen is just quietly one of those guys that, just because he wasn't an Albert Pujols, a Ryan Howard, one of these big names, I feel like he kind of falls into the shadow a little bit, almost kind of similar to a Curt Schilling, but I still feel like it's still one of those players that whenever you look more into it and you think about the career of Scott Rolen, a very impactful player in the Cincinnati, or the St. Louis days, a very impactful player in Philadelphia. If you look at his numbers, he was an absolute stud. Absolutely ridiculous numbers he was putting up in the season he got traded in 04 or not 04, 02 to the St. Louis Cardinals. It was just absolutely crazy what Scott Rolen could do. And I didn't think he was going to be in the Hall until I took a little bit of a deeper look into his stats. And that's honestly the same thing I have for another guy we're going to talk about later on. But I still think Scott Rolen walks away with my vote. I think it's one of those guys that I feel like deserves a little bit of recognition. Yes, he wasn't the guy, and I understand that he wasn't the guy, but typically during a time, there's only one guy. So to say he's not the guy doesn't mean he's not deserving. And I still think he was amongst one of the best players of his time frame being in the league. He just did it on a more quiet, kind of low-key level. He's never that big flashy player. He was never this, in your face, kind of just a small, quiet, country kid that just made everything happen, just made all the plays that, came through when you needed him offensively and just made it happen. And to me, it's just good enough for an MLB to get a check mark on my ballot.
Scott Rolen was a good player, and I have to give credit where credit is due. He had some good years, but there's nothing here that's standing out to me that screams Hall of Famer. I mean, he did have a prime, around 03, 04, and that's where he had his best offensive seasons. 04, he had his only OPS season where it was over 1,000, and that's great. And a lot of seasons around that, he was in the 800 to that one season 1,000 mark in OPS, which is great. But there are lower points in his career. Obviously, you mentioned with injuries, the offense somewhat sputtered out towards the end. He was an all-star in 2011 with only 5 home runs, an OPS of under 700. All-star appearances, of course, have to be taken with a grain of salt, but there's a clear decline. After his age 29 season, he only hits double-digit homers 4 more times. And I'm not saying you have to be a power guy to get into the Hall, but the average does take a slight dip. It fluctuates at times, but he hits 300 a couple more times, but from there it's 270 and lower, and it's just not the right end to a career. He only had just over 2,000 hits. Of the 11 third basemen that are in the Hall of Fame, only 4 of them have less hits than that. And the last one to play was in 1957. So it was a much different time back then. Third basemen now, of course, there are plenty that are known for their defense, but a lot of times it does come down to offensive production. You have guys like Nolan Arenado now who can do both, which is great. And I can't wait to have that conversation about Arenado in a couple of years, several years, because that's going to be a fun one. But a guy like Rolen, you're a great defensive player, and we're going to talk about a great defensive player up next, who has his own question marks for the Hall. I'm kind of having the same trouble here. The offense is definitely evident, over 300 home runs, a career 281 hitter, but I'm personally not seeing enough here. I would like a little more for someone that I consider a Hall of Famer. It's not even like he had great success as a team guy. I know I'm not supposed to mention rings. He had 1, which is great. But you do sometimes see guys kind of get favored a little more due to their success on a team level. I feel like a guy with 5 rings would somewhat have more of a case than someone with the exact same stats and only 1 ring. And I just think that's how things go. But, Rolen was a good player, and there's no denying that. And he still has a few years left on the ballot. He had significant growth last year, but I don't know. It's going to be interesting to see. I'm not going to check that box personally. But once again, I do see why you check that box, and anybody else out there, I'm sure, has their thoughts on Scott Rolen. It's definitely one of the more interesting cases we have on the ballot, because he was good, but was he good enough? And I think that's where people will differ.
My big thing for Scott Rolen, especially like during his, I would say, prime, before the injuries started rolling around and everything, from 1997, which was his first full season at the age of 22, all the way up until 2004, whenever he was 29. Obviously some very influential years in your career. He never had an OPS plus below 120. So, whenever you're talking about, that's a good that's a good 7-8 year span where you are quietly one of the greatest hitters, in the league. Whenever league average is 120 is saying that you are 20% better than than just your average guy in the league. And obviously these are the greatest hitters in the sport of baseball. To get up to the major league level, you have to be up to a level of par to where you are so good in the first place. Obviously I played baseball for 14 years. I'm not hitting any pitch over probably 75 nowadays. It is what it is. But Scott Rolen he is a curious case. And I think to where his offense does fall a little bit short, I think I'm also pushing up the defense a little bit. Obviously, Gold Gloves and defense in general is part of the game. And to be 8 Gold Gloves, obviously one of the highest Gold Glove getters among third basemen in MLB history. There aren't too many that have more than that. Obviously, first one comes to mind, Brooke Robinson. But there aren't too many third basemen in the league with 8 Gold Gloves. One of the premier defenders, obviously, you mentioned Nolan Arenado, who, yes, has a little bit more of an offensive upside, but maybe think more a little bit of a Matt Chapman, a guy who can hit, a guy who's not the greatest hitter on his team, but is very much defensively sound. And I think that's kind of a fun comparison to look at nowadays, thinking of that. But I still think Scott Rolen was an outstanding hitter during his time. Obviously fell off a little bit due to the injuries. But for the most part, whenever, he had a couple of, injury ridden seasons. In 2002, he only played 50 games. In 2005, he only played 56. Towards the tail end of his career after leaving St. Louis, he only had about 1 or 2 seasons where he played over 100. So longevity does come a little bit into question. And so is it a long shot? I don't know, because of the percentages. Whenever you're looking at the percentages, are already more than 50% of the people voting in Scott Rolen into the Hall of Fame. So is it a long shot? I'm not sure. For me, I look at the numbers. I see a guy who was maybe just overshadowed. A guy who was statistically very, very good at his time, very good defensively, and picks up defensively for where he may have fallen short offensively. And for me, for how elite he was on both sides of the ball, it's good enough for me to check the box.
I'm trying to do some research here because you mentioned the OPS plus, how 120 was somewhat impressive. I'm having trouble finding the league leaders in a year like 04, but I do know Bonds led the league in 04 with an OPS plus of 263. So
this is Barry Bonds.
I don't know how big the gap is, and I don't know how many people are in between Bonds and Rolen, but I'd have to imagine there's a good amount, because Bonds, I'm sure, had a big lead on that, but it couldn't have been that big as to where you got over 100 of a gap. So I know there are definitely players there. And you mentioned top 20 in hitting, and that could still that could remain true. There still could be a 20-man gap between Bonds and Rolen. But the truth of that matter is OPS plus, I know it's not an analytic necessarily, but it's one of the newer stats. They add they factor in the ballpark thing. Even I sometimes don't understand these new analytics, but OPS plus itself, you have someone up there in the 260s, which means there has to be more higher than 120, which in perspective is only a little bit above average, which is what I say. I mean, he's above average, but he's not elite. And I think that's basically my main point. But I just
want to see what a great hitter would be like today in 2021, because obviously whenever you're looking at Barry Bonds in 04 and he's hitting 362 and slugging 812, these are numbers that aren't seen today. 362 average isn't happening. Nobody's slugging 812. A lot of people's OPS isn't 812. So, this is 263 for Barry Bonds in that year. Absolutely. But I mean, come on.
I just did a quick name type and
No, I understand.
but no, but Vlad, I mean, you said today's game. Vlad Jr. led the AL in OPS plus with 169. So yeah, you're not going to get 260 something with Barry Bonds necessarily, but you are going to get, a couple of notches higher. And that's the guy that finished second in MVP voting this year. So OPS plus is an interesting stat, and it doesn't tell the full story, but definitely a decent piece of it. I did not check the box for Rolen. Will did. In conclusion, we'll move to Omar Vizquel, who we've discussed in prior videos because his case, of course, is one of the more interesting ones. Obviously, very defensive heavy, and Cooperstown has seen the likes of Luis Aparicio, Pee Wee Reese, guys like that who are defensively sound much more than their offense get elected into the Hall. And Vizquel's getting up there on the ballot, but he played 24 years, almost 3,000 hits, 2,800, almost 2,900. He's a career 272 hitter, which isn't bad by any means, but of course the story is his defense, 11 gold gloves, ninth all time in defensive WAR. He was probably the best defender of his generation, coming in right after, the Ozzie Smith generation. And, you can't ignore that, but it really kind of how with David Ortiz, how do you value designated hitters? How do you value defense? And, some people put a lot into that. And some people say, if you can't work both sides of baseball, you're not good enough for the Hall. Will, what do you think of Omar Vizquel?
Omar Vizquel is only getting my vote for two different reasons. One, because of the precedence of Luis Aparicio. If you let in somebody like Luis Aparicio, I think you have to let in Omar Vizquel. And I think that's just reminds me of the judiciary system in the United States. If this happens prior, you need to follow this. This is what we have. This is the blueprint for what makes the Hall. If this is good enough, then this is good enough. And if I'm looking at Luis Aparicio, I'm looking at Omar Vizquel thinking, the hell is he not doing in the Hall yet? Obviously 24 years, he was always a below average hitter, was never the outstanding guy whenever it came to hitting, but always one of the more defensively sound shortstops. And I don't want to compare him to Ozzie Smith. Ozzie Smith was so defensively sound, it was ridiculous. The best defender at the shortstop position of all time. And an underrated hitter, I would say. Obviously didn't have the power, but an underrated hitter whenever it came down to it. Yes, he has more hits. Yes, he has all of this, but he was also in the league, I want to say 5 more years than Ozzie Smith. So that's one precedent. And number two is the fact that, again, it kind of reminds me a little bit of Scott Rolen, to where he never really took a substantial dip. He was never the above average hitter, but he never also took a substantial deep dive. Whenever I think of somebody like Andrew Jones, who's also on this ballot, a very great defensive center fielder. Some people called him the greatest defensive center fielder of all time. And he was an outstanding hitter for a 10-year period. And then he hit 32 and fell off the face of the earth. And for me, it's all about longevity. And Omar Vizquel did the thing till he was 45 and did it around the same level. I mean, yeah, he had better offensive seasons than his age 45 season, but he never really took that significant of a dip. It was always just, this is who Omar Vizquel is. You know exactly what you're getting. And for me, it was good enough. It's just good enough. Omar Vizquel is a guy that I do, but I don't want to put on the ballot. He is by far the closest name that I came to I don't know. But after looking more into it, I feel like it's right to put him in, just because of what I said. You knew exactly what you were getting with Omar Vizquel. You're getting one of the better defensive shortstops in MLB history. You're getting a relatively consistent hitter, though it's not exactly the greatest average. Shortstop is not exactly known to be a very, statistically offensive heavy position. So I'm not expecting him to go absolutely haywire. I'm not expecting A-Rod numbers or Cal Ripken numbers out of him. you got what you got with Omar Vizquel. He almost did it for 25 years. Did it solid. And like I said, if you're going to let somebody like Luis Aparicio in, I feel like precedence allows somebody like Omar Vizquel to be in the Hall of Fame as well.
I'm right there with you. I do think that Omar Vizquel should be a Hall of Famer because of, the longevity and basically the defensive consistency. But looking side by side with Aparicio, of course, Vizquel did play 6 more years than Aparicio, so we had a lot more opportunities to kind of pad the stats, but a higher career average, more career runs, 100 less stolen bases, but Vizquel still stole 404, which is impressive. Defensively, they're similar. Gold Gloves, I don't know when Gold Gloves started being an award, but Aparicio has 9. Vizquel, with more years, was able to get more Gold Gloves. But of course, especially not this day and age with the whole Jeter controversy, how do you value a Gold Glove? Both of them have a pretty high WAR. Aparicio's is higher, 55.8. He did play on a better team. They have a World Series they won in 1966. Vizquel, all those years, did not win a World Series. I think the closest he got was 1997 with the Indians. Overall, nonetheless, it's a great career for Vizquel. It's not what you want to see offensively necessarily, but we've seen defensive shortstops, and there's a chance, in the future we have a similar conversation with a guy like Andrelton Simmons, who has been one of the best defenders of, the past 10, 15 years, but offense has never been his strong suit. So always an interesting conversation.
Simmons stays in here for like another 10 years. Honestly, that's really not a bad comparison. I didn't even think of that.
Yeah, it is a conversation that we're probably going to have when the time comes for Andrelton Simmons, because he has been on that level of guys like Omar Vizquel. So I'm checking the box. You checking the box?
I would have to check the box for Omar Vizquel. It's a very hesitant check, but I am going to give the check.
It's closer to our border, our line that we don't want to cross, but
it is my last. It is my all right. I'll give it to you.
It's our guilty pleasure selection. It's
a little bit.
You gotta. It's Omar, but we'll move to the last one. We'll go super in depth on, and it's one that I know Will's been waiting to talk about.
Oh.
I'm interested to see what he's bringing to the table. It's we're going to talk some Todd Helton. 17 seasons with the Rockies, never found success in the postseason. It's the Rockies, but he had a great career. 5-time All-Star, 4-time Silver Slugger, won a few Gold Gloves, career .316 hitter. Pretty impressive stuff. Will, let's see what you got.
This man is one of the most pure first base hitters in MLB history. Granted, he is Mr. Rocky, and that's kind of easy when you've been with the team since 3-5 years after they became a franchise.
Yeah.
Sure, you're going to lead the league, and you never left. You were there all 17 years. You're going to lead the team in almost every single statistical category. It is what it is. That aside, Todd Helton had a .315 batting average or higher for the first 8 seasons in his career. That's only been done by 3 people, one of them being Todd Helton. The other 2 names are Bill Terry and Lou Gehrig, who are both in the Hall of Fame. Obviously, get used to the name Lou Gehrig because a lot of the comparisons are Lou Gehrig. He is the only MLB player in history with 10 consecutive seasons of 35 or more doubles. He is also the only player in MLB history with back-to-back seasons over 100 extra base hits, which is absolutely ridiculous. A pure hitter, and it continues. There are 4 players that have that are the only players in MLB history to record back-to-back seasons with 400 total bases or more. Todd Helton, Chuck Klein, Jimmy Fox, Lou Gehrig. 3 of those 4 Hall of Famers. The one that's not is Todd Helton. Only 6 players have had more than 5,000 plate appearances with a better slash line in all categories than Todd Helton. Stan Musial, Babe Ruth, Jimmy Fox, Ted Williams, Rogers Hornsby, Lou Gehrig. Those are the only names to end with at least 5,000 plate appearances to end with a better average, slugging, and on-base percentage. I mean, the numbers go on and on. It's ridiculous how pure of a hitter he was, and everybody and their mom, and I feel like this is why he hasn't been put in yet, is going to yell, Coors effect. Don't give me that shit. It's Todd Helton. This is pure hitting. This is just absolute amazing hitting. It'd be different if he was like the home run king and he had like 800, 900 home runs. But he's finding gaps. He's hitting doubles. He's hitting triples. Obviously he's hitting home runs, but it's not like the home runs are the big thing in his career. It's getting on base. It's walking. He was a very good discipline at bat. He's an amazing hitter finding the gaps. He ranks second all time among people who have played at least 2,000 games at first base in WAR. In OPS. The only other first baseman to play at least 2,000 games has a higher OPS, Lou Gehrig. And there are 6 players with at least 2,000 games at first base who have a higher WAR than Todd Helton. All of them are Hall of Famers, but Rafael Palmeiro. It's just absolutely ridiculous to hear all of these names that he's compared with. In fact, only 4 players in MLB history have a higher OPS than Todd Helton. And that's McGuire, Bonds, Manny Ramirez, who are all associated with PEDs, and then Mike Trout, who's not even eligible yet. Todd Helton is an absolute pure hitter, an absolute pure on-base machine, and I didn't realize it until I did a little bit more of a statistical dive, looked more into it. Shout out Matt Stathead subscription for that. But Todd Helton is just an absolute guy. He's just a dude, and he just got on base. He did everything he could, whether it be hitting, whether it be walking, no matter what it was. Todd Helton, if you needed to get on base, Todd Helton was already on base. I think it's crazy to look at these numbers and to hear some of these names that he's compared with and not think he deserves to be in the Hall of Fame. Because of that, I have to check the box.
I will admit, I was hesitant before we went on with this about Todd Helton. He flies under the radar his whole career as a Rocky. He's not necessarily in the spotlight. I don't want to say he got MVP votes for that 5-year stretch he had around 2000 to 2004. But after that, everything went quiet. He had MVP votes again in 2009, it looks like, his age 35 season. But it's interesting because how do you value one's prime? I mean, is it 5 years? Should it be longer, shorter? Because there is a clear-cut prime here, but one thing it doesn't drop is, the consistency batting average wise. He continues to hit 300 for years after. Even his last couple of years, he hits it a couple more times. No first baseman has more doubles than Todd Helton. I feel like that's key to mention. Like you said, he just found gaps. You don't have to be a great power hitter, whether you're at Coors or anywhere, any ballpark really. It's about production. And there are seasons where he had over 100 RBIs. He did that, I think, 4 times during that, prime stretch of his career. There are a lot of signs pointing to Todd Helton being in Cooperstown. And I mean, just this past year, he did have a big jump on the ballot. I want to find the percentage here. It was a big jump. 2020, it was 29%, and it was almost 45% last year. So a pretty significant jump, almost doubled. And I'm really actually looking forward to seeing what happens this year because, the more we discuss it, I think I can thank you somewhat for convincing me. I'm going to check him off on the ballot. I've always liked Todd Helton, but I did somewhat question if what he did was enough. But I do think that his work somewhat went unnoticed because you don't see it. His postseason appearances were few and far between. He had the World Series in 2007 and he hit well in the World Series, but his team didn't. They got swept. And then a first round exit in, I think, 2009, there really wasn't much positive to say about Helton's career team-wise. He didn't get much success in Colorado, but he was always a bright point in that offense. And I do think that should be acknowledged and possibly rewarded somewhere down the line. Do I think this year he'll have another massive jump and break that 75% mark? No, but he does have plenty more years. I mean, this is his 4th year on the ballot. There's so much time. If he keeps consistently growing, if you grow 20% every time, you're going to have it next year, So definitely it'll be interesting to watch. Definitely one of the guys I'll be paying attention to is Todd Helton. I mean, underrated. I think that's the best way to put it. When you're drawing Lou Gehrig comparisons, you really can't argue against that. So you're checking the box and thanks to you, I think I'm checking the box too.
And I think it's just because he plays first base on a bad team. At the end of the day, obviously, all-star games and everything plays a big role. Do you have his reference up? How many times was he
I
an
do.
all-star?
He was a 5-time All-Star.
And that's kind of, again, that's under the radar. That's low for Todd Helton. That should be a little bit higher. But whenever you're playing on an underperforming team, on a newer expansion team that doesn't have the biggest of fan bases, you're not going to get those votes, especially when you're playing in a time with guys like Pujols, with Ryan Howard. These are players. Ryan Howard, if I'm not mistaken, on the ballot this year. And would have to look into him if his career wasn't so shortened. And everything such as that. But it's just that there's so many. Prince Fielder was in the National League at this time. There was a lot of good first basemen in the National League. And of course, the first baseman position is just idolized by the home run. And again, like I said, it would be different if the home run was the thing that was Todd Helton's persona. But the Coors effect has nothing to do with finding gaps and finding the hole. And that's what happens when you're hitting 300 plus consistently. You're not putting it over the fence every single time. You're finding the hole. You're finding the gap. Even on the road in his career, he still batted 284 on the road. And that's really good. Whenever you're sitting there thinking of it, you're going to be pretty happy with a 250 average. 250 is not in the hall. 250 is not in the hall, but you're going to be pretty consistent. If you're getting on base a fourth of the time, you're going to be relatively happy with your guy. And he's still doing it almost at a 300 mark, and a 300 mark is the Hall of Fame. And to see, after I took a little bit of a deeper dive, after I looked more into it, Todd Helton is a guy that I think definitely deserves to be in the Hall of Fame. And I feel like someone with like the induction of Larry Walker finally getting a Rocky into the Hall of Fame is really going to help his case. And he's going to find his way in there, hopefully by the end of year 10.
Yeah, you would think so. And you look at this year's ballot, there is some first base competition entering. A lot of first year guys, Ryan Howard, Justin Morneau, Prince Fielder, as you mentioned, Mark Teixeira. But you compare these guys to Todd Helton, and a few guys might come close. I think Teixeira is the best of those new guys. Prince Fielder, of course, his career got cut short due to the neck injury. But Todd Helton is above and beyond the best first baseman on this ballot. And, whether or not you value first base as, more of a offensive position, I think nowadays with guys like Anthony Rizzo and Freddie Freeman, it's becoming more acknowledged defensively because it's very important, the first base position. Todd Helton, we're going to check him off. We didn't have plans to mention this guy, but, realizing that he's here, I really want to talk about him. It's Manny Ramirez, another, steroid guy, but also had talent that can't really be denied. He was a career 312 hitter, 555 home runs. I know I'm kind of throwing this at you out of nowhere, but, there's definitely, it's worth talking about. I mean, he won a batting title, 12-time All-Star. Obviously, he won he had a couple rings, 69.3 WAR. Manny Ramirez was a good player. At the end of his career, kind of spiraled out of control with, the heightened steroid issues and him somewhat having to retire from baseball because they said you either take the 1-year suspension or retire. So, he had that 2011 year, his age 39 season, 5 games with the Rays, and then they told him, take the year off or you're done. And he chose to be done. I think he went and played overseas somewhere for a little after, but he had a clear-cut prime, obviously, made his name for himself in Cleveland, wound up going to Boston, reversing the curse with them. He had some great seasons, definitely not first ballot, just based on everything. But since we're having a conversation about A-Rod and Clemens and Bonds, I mean, you kind of got to talk about Manny.
Yeah, Manny's kind of the guy that just falls onto the cusp. And it's one of those things to where I feel like if you vote for A-Rod, you have to feel okay with the idea of voting for Manny. Both involved in the same scandal, and everything. And they were the two kind of premier names along with Ryan Braun around that time that really got caught with the PEDs. And that's the thing, is that whenever I said earlier, whenever I think of somebody who took PEDs and everything, I have to put them on a completely different pedestal. I have to put them high enough to where I think the PEDs weren't a problem. And granted, in his time in Cleveland, he was an absolute stud, throughout the 90s and before he went into Boston in 2001. He was an amazing player, multiple all-star nods, multiple silver sluggers, runner-up rookie of the year in 94. He was a great player. And if I'm not mistaken, a very phenomenal player in getting on base, drew a lot of walks, a very patient hitter at the plate. He was one of the more obvious cases, similar to a Barry Bonds that was kind of, went from a really skinny kid to all of a sudden you're yoked. But I think Manny Ramirez kind of falls into the category of it's not how you start, it's how you finish. And the way that his career went really left a bad taste in people's mouths. His time with the White Sox, his time with the Rays, his tail end of his Dodgers career, left a sour taste in a lot of people's mouths. And then the whole suspension, refusing to serve the suspension, is also not great. Manny Ramirez is one of the more entertaining players of that time in the early 2000s, the late 90s, everything such as that. Definitely one of the more entertaining players. I remember him robbing a home run, high-fiving a fan and doubling him up at first base. Obviously a very classic moment in Manny Ramirez's career. Mannyville out in left field, out in at Dodger Stadium. There's a lot of good things with Manny Ramirez, but whenever you're looking at him, Manny Ramirez, if I'm not mistaken, 69, 70 WAR, something along those lines.
Yep.
A-Rod had like 113. So whenever you're looking at the numbers, I mean, A-Rod was still such a generational player. Manny Ramirez was a very, very good player. And, I would say an elite player at his time. And then he just kind of fell victim to getting into the wrong thing, and then never really took that big career leap, and then also never served his dues, and I think that's going to cause a lot of writers and everybody else to leave him off the ballot. More of just the moral wrongdoing. That's why I really pointed out that A-Rod served his suspension. A-Rod, it was like, okay, what I did was wrong. He served his suspension. He came back, played a full season, retired mid-season the season following, but he tried to right his wrongs. Manny Ramirez has not. He just kind of avoided the problem, ran off, and then has not been a part of Major League Baseball today. A-Rod, we see him on Sunday Night Baseball, Monday night, or whatever it is, commentating games. So, he's worked his way back into the game. And he's becoming a likable guy. Whenever he was in the league, A-Rod, I didn't like him. I mean, he's on a dynasty. He's a full of himself player. At least that's how he seemed. And everything about him was just, you just didn't want to like him if you weren't a Yankees fan. And now, he's in the booth and everything. And honestly, he's a likable dude. I enjoy listening to him. I enjoy listening to him commentate games, and I like A-Rod. And I hope he finds his way into Cooperstown, because he's still one of the greatest players to ever play baseball. Overall, I can't say that about Manny Ramirez. And I think that's why a lot of people are going to leave him off.
I don't think WAR tells the whole story. There are other guys like Frank Thomas is only 73. It's only just higher.
For sure.
And he's high on that similarity score here on Baseball Reference. But I'm really enjoying this research I'm doing here. Batting averages from 1995 all the way to 2010. Manny Ramirez's batting average did not dip under 290. This guy was at times known for power. There were several seasons where he hit above 40 home runs, which is great. But the fact that he could hit for contact too is even better. High average guys like that always get more points in my book. You want to talk about OPS plus from 1994 all the way to 2010. It was over 100 at least. Before the 5 games with the Rays was negative 66. So that's interesting. So yeah, I mean, Manny, he was never a defensively sound player. I remember that moment where he cut off Damon's throw out in left field, and that was the whole thing. That's probably his most well-known defensive moment, besides the wall climb in Baltimore where he high-fives the fan. But all this WAR and everything he accumulated is pretty much all offensively based. 555 home runs is special. 312 batting average for his whole career is special. That's Helton level. Helton was a career 316 hitter. Obviously, steroids and the way he went out played into it a bit. He hasn't gained much ground so far in voting. I want to find the percentages here. This will be his 6th year on the ballot. And last year, actually from 2020 to 2021, he stayed exactly the same at 28.2. So
Wow.
perhaps things are moving stagnant, but just 2 years ago, or 2019 to 2020, he jumped a decent 6%. So I'm interested to see what happens this year, especially coming off a year where he didn't gain anything at all. There is some more outfield competition in this year's ballot, guys coming in, Carl Crawford. What else we got here? We still got Bobby Abreu on the ballot, Torrey Hunter, Sammy Sosa in his last year, Barry Bonds, Gary Sheffield entering the end of his kind of run on the ballot, Andrew Jones, which might be one that you see gain a lot of percentage points this year. I think he's a name you see make a big jump. But yeah, I don't know if in the end Manny will be a Hall of Famer. Like you said, how things ended wasn't great, and I still don't think he has the best relationship with Major League Baseball right now, but he is still a fan favorite overall. And I haven't seen him on many ballots yet so far from what I've seen submitted, but do I check? I don't know if I should check the box. I'm
not going to check the box literally just because he didn't serve the suspension. If he tried to right his wrong and tried to, work a way out to where he'd be like, what I did was incorrect. I apologize. It is what it is. Let me serve my suspension. Let me try to come back and prove that I can be an elite player. Obviously with those stats, no steroids, he's in the Hall. Looking at those numbers, he's absolutely 100% in the Hall of Fame without steroids. But the problem is that he committed the wrongdoing of doing steroids, which is ultimately incorrect at a time to where he knew it was incorrect, at a time where MLB was strictly enforcing this. And it became an issue. And then he didn't want to admit that he didn't want to face his problems. And I think that really leaves a sour taste in MLB's mouth. And MLB is very much about integrity of the game, doing right. And that's the only place where I feel like A-Rod gets off. I feel like if A-Rod was just like, no, I didn't do anything wrong, and then didn't serve his suspension, I think you're talking a completely different story. I think you're going to have a lot more pushback. But I think ultimately, since he did it and he's working his way back into the game, I think A-Rod will, by the time his 10th year comes, I think he's in the Hall of Fame, if not even the first year. A lot of writers may just kind of forgive and forget, and try to let it go, especially with the big push being the 10th year. This is going to be a big year for Clemens. This is a big year for Bonds. This is a big year for Sosa. This is going to be a big year for a lot of players. And I think that A-Rod's coming in right at the right time, because if you're going to start voting for Clemens, you're going to start voting for Bonds. A lot of people are going to be like, well, why don't we vote for A-Rod? And then, I feel like he might get a pretty big, decent jump his first year if he's not a first ballot Hall of Famer.
I looked up one more stat, and because of it, I am going to check Manny Ramirez's box. Career OPS 996. It's 12th all time. Right in front of him, Mike Trout, and everyone above them, Hall of Famers. So not just going off that, but I do think this was the deciding factor for me to put Manny Ramirez in the Hall of Fame. Is there anyone else you want to add?
No, I mean, I feel like there were a couple players that were close. Like I really wanted to check Billy Wagner. I wanted to check, I thought about Andrew Jones. If Andrew Jones didn't have such a sharp decline after his age 32 season, definitely would consider checking that box. A name that intrigues me that's new this year is Joe Nathan. I love that name. I feel like one of the better pitchers. Especially whenever you like kind of filter out to like 900 innings and look at, I think Billy Wagner had the lowest whip of any pitcher with at least 900 innings, which is absolutely like even below Mariano Rivera, below like all your greats. If I'm not mistaken, if he's not the lowest, he's like top 5. Joe Nathan somewhere in there as well. It's absolutely ridiculous what those two guys could do as closers. And I feel like this is going to be two names that you see around for a little bit. Relief pitchers are obviously a little bit weird. People don't really know how to exactly to vote for them, because outside of like your greats back in the day, you haven't really seen anybody of the relief position make the Hall of Fame other than Mo, who was obvious, and Trevor Hoffman.
Yeah.
and so since then you don't really see anybody. But Andrew Jones was one. Jeff Kent's a fun name that I wouldn't mind voting for. But other than that, I mean, a lot of these names, there's a lot of cases for a lot of players on there. Obviously, if you make the list, if you make the ballot, there's a reason you're there. Not everybody does, but there are a lot of people who make the qualifications that still don't make the ballot. So if you're on the ballot, there's obviously some type of case for you to be in the Hall of Fame. But yeah, a couple of those names are on there that I really wouldn't mind checking, but knowing how Cooperstown works, you're just not going to see some of these guys. I would vote. If I had to vote my other two, I checked off 8 boxes. If I had to add the other two, it'd probably be Billy Wagner and Joe Nathan, just to add them, just because relief pitcher is such a weird position, relief closer, but yeah, other than that, I mean, there's a lot of other players in there that I think deserve that you may see come into the Veterans Committee, such as a Jeff Kent, such as an Andrew Jones. But within the 10-year, I don't know if that's necessarily the right way to get them in. So a very good ballot nonetheless, but yeah, plenty of players on there that definitely deserve a case.
It's a stacked ballot for sure. Here's a look at our final ballots. Everything's checked how we would have it. One final look at that before we head out. But for Will Polston, I've been Matthew Perry. This has been GMs for Hire with our 2022 Baseball Hall of Fame ballot review. And we'll see you guys next time. Thank you for watching.